Tears of the Apache Girl. Please, I'd rather belong to you than to them. The Texas sun in the summer of 1870 was merciless, a white-hot disk hanging in an endless sky. Heat shimmered over the Mercer homestead, 30 acres of dust and fence wire clinging to survival. Daniel Mercer, 35 and weathered beyond his years, drove a post into the dry earth, his undershirt damp with sweat. His horse twitched at flies, the only rhythm breaking the silence of land and memory. Then came a sound he did not expect, a faint scrape, a broken breath. Daniel paused, hand sliding to the revolver on his hip. His eyes turned toward the old well near the back of the property, long dry weeds curling around its stone rim. Boots crunching against brittle dirt, he approached carefully. Peering down, he saw her. A woman, crouched in the hollow skin, browned by sunbraid, half-unraveled turquoise beads hanging loose from her wrist. Her dress was torn, dusted with blood and grime. Her eyes, wide and desperate, locked on his. "Please," she whispered, voice raw, "I don't want to belong to them. Let me belong to you instead." Daniel froze. He had heard such pleas before out on the borderlands where men sold lives like livestock. Every instinct told him to walk away. The law had little patience for mercy, and harboring someone like her was as dangerous as any outlaw. But then he saw not just fear in her eyes, but a last desperate gamble. It struck a memory, a child clutching her mother's skirts, flames in the night, his own rifle firing into smoke. The hammer of that memory fell hard. Daniel shut his eyes. When he opened them again, the woman was still there, trembling in the shadow of the well. He knelt, saying nothing, and reached down. For a moment she hesitated, then seized his hand. Her palm was thin, rough, sticky with dried blood. He pulled her up, steadying her as she stumbled barefoot onto the dust. A cut above her brow seeped slowly, bruises tracing one cheek, but she did not cry. They stood in silence, the wind cutting across the land. At last she spoke. "No one followed me. I lost them by the riverbed." Daniel studied her, his jaw hard, but something in his gaze shifted. "If you stay even one night," he said quietly, nodding toward the barn, "wash the blood off. There's water in the trough." She blinked, startled, then followed his direction. Daniel returned to his fence posts, lifting the hammer again. From the rim of the well, a crow let out a single sharp cry, as if to mark the moment the past rose from dust to meet him again. 2 days passed. The woman rose before dawn, washing her clothes in the creek sweeping the porch without being asked. When Daniel returned from the fields, he found buckets, filled knives, scrubbed clean, the hearth swept. She spoke little, her eyes lowered, her movements precise. To her, this place was only a pause, never a home. She had carried too many names, each one belonging to someone else's claim. Daniel did not press her for answers. He recognized the hard set of her shoulders, the tension of someone braced for the next blow. He had seen it before in soldiers readying for battles they did not expect to return from. But he noticed, too, how the land responded. She worked the dry soil behind the cabin, mixing ash with compost, turning dust with her hands. Within a week, green shoots pushed up along the fence line, stubborn against the sun. Daniel watched without comment. On the third morning, riders appeared on the horizon. 2 men in dusty coats, rifles across their backs, badges dulled by wind. Tax surveyors circling like buzzards. Daniel spotted them from the pasture, cursed under his breath, and strode back to the cabin. The woman, still nameless to him, was rinsing dishes in a basin. She caught his expression and froze. "Inside," Daniel said. She obeyed without question, slipping into the house. The riders dismounted, one consulting a ledger. Mercer, he called annual check. Holdings livestock anyone living here. Same as last year, Daniel replied evenly. 2 horses, 1 mule. Just me. The younger man squinted toward the house. Thought I saw someone by your porch. Daniel's hand curled at his side. His voice stayed steady. Took on help. Housekeeper. Long year. Name. He hesitated only a second before taking the ledger, writing slowly, firmly, Elena Black. The officer repeated it. Daniel added, my mother's name, Cherokee. Girls got nowhere else to go. A tense silence followed long enough to choke breath. Then the younger man shrugged. So long as she doesn't stir trouble. She won't, Daniel said flatly. When they rode off, leaving dust and suspicion behind Daniel's shoulders eased. That night, as the woman shelled beans by the hearth, he passed by with firewood. Without turning, he said quietly, Black. Her hands stilled. You gave me a name. You needed one, he answered. She looked down at her bruised hands, lips trembling but dry. She had belonged to too many names. This one was written in ink in front of men with badges. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning. The nights in Texas were cooler than the days, but not by much. Heat clung to the earth like a second skin, and the cabin walls gave no relief. Daniel Mercer often found himself awake long after the fire burned low, staring into embers that glowed like the ghosts of old battles. Yet now, when he turned from the hearth, he saw her. The girl who had once crouched in his well now sat cross-legged on the floor, quiet as a shadow, her dark braid falling over her shoulder. She moved through his home without sound, always working. Each morning before dawn, she rose, swept the porch, and fetched water from the creek. By the time Daniel returned from the fields, coffee simmered on the stove, boots were cleaned of mud tools laid in order. She never asked for thanks. She never asked for anything. But her presence had begun to thread itself into the fabric of his days. One evening, after the surveyors had gone, she lingered by the fire with her hands folded in her lap. The name he had given her, Elena Black, hung in the air like smoke neither of them could clear. She touched her wrist where the turquoise beads rested. You gave me more than shelter, she said quietly, not looking at him. You gave me a name. Daniel shifted, uncomfortable with the weight in her voice. Everyone needs one, he said. He did not add that names could mean survival out here, or that he had chosen his mother's name because it was the only truth he trusted enough to share. Elena studied her calloused palms, scarred with both work and violence. She whispered as though confessing, I've belonged to too many names before. None of them mine. Daniel did not answer. He simply stoked the fire, but his silence was different now, less like stone, more like acknowledgement. The land around the Mercer place began to change. Elena rose before dawn each day to tend the brittle soil. She cleared rocks, mixed in ash from the hearth, pressed her fingers into the earth until her nails blackened. Slowly, stubbornly, green returned. Corn and beans sprouted where neighbors swore nothing could grow. By midsummer, a narrow garden bent with promise behind the cabin. People noticed. Horsemen rode past more often, their eyes lingering too long on the yard. At the general store, Daniel heard whispers. That red girl's up to something, one rancher muttered, spitting in the dust. Land like his don't bloom unless it's cursed, another replied. Daniel said nothing, only paid for his nails and sugar before leaving. But Elena heard too. She saw the way some children threw pebbles when they passed the fence, calling her names she'd long since learned to ignore. One afternoon, as she bent to gather beans, 3 boys crept near laughing. Hey, engine girl, one taunted bet you whisper to your crops. A stone struck her arm. She flinched but did not rise. Their laughter carried until Daniel stepped from the barn hammer still in hand. He didn't speak. He only stood behind her, tall and unmovable, his shadow stretching across the dirt. The boys froze, then scattered fear, driving their legs faster than cruelty. Elena didn't turn. That evening, however, she hung a woven ring of sage and dried grass above the kitchen window. Not decoration, but a quiet claim. This is a place. This is mine. 2 weeks later, trouble came in the form of a man. Daniel was splitting fence posts when he heard the clop of deliberate hooves. A rider approached, tall and sharp in black leather, a scar cutting through his brow. He dismounted with the slow confidence of someone who believed the land already belonged to him. After noon, he drawled, hand resting near the pistol at his hip. Name's Caleb Draper. Heard you've been keeping what isn't yours. Daniel straightened, axe in hand. She's not yours either. Draper's smile curved sly and cruel. Bought her fair. She ran. I came to collect. Daniel's jaw clenched. You'll leave now. Careful, Mercer Draper said, stepping closer. I remember you from the Sierra runs. $50 a scalp, wasn't it? You hunted Apache same as me. Don't pretend you're holy now. The words struck like a lash, but Daniel didn't flinch. His grip only tightened on the axe handle. Tell you what, Draper continued, his voice smooth with malice. Sell her back. I'll even give you a cut. Easier for everyone. Behind them, Elena stood frozen near the cabin, breath shallow. She saw the tremor in Daniel's shoulders, the rage that boiled up from an old life he tried to bury. Slowly, he let the axe fall and lifted a heavier tool, a shovel meant for digging graves as well as earth. Draper's grin faltered as Daniel stepped forward, each stride deliberate. The air thickened, wind pressing hard against the grass. You want her? Daniel's voice was low, rough. You think I won't bury you so deep, even the coyotes won't sniff you out. His knuckles whitened on the shovel's handle. Draper's hand twitched toward his gun. Don't. The single word cut through the air sharp as a blade. Elena stepped between them, small frame, tense her body, a fragile wall against violence. Her voice shook, but her eyes locked on Daniel's. Don't become what they were. For a long moment, neither man moved. Sweat trickled down Daniel's neck, his chest heaving. Then, with a long, shuddering breath, he lowered the shovel. It struck the ground with a dull thud. Draper let out a nervous chuckle, though his eyes flickered with unease. You've got fire in her, I'll give you that. But fire won't make her yours. She ain't free. She's not mine, Daniel said, voice steady. She's free. Draper sneered, spat in the dust, and swung back onto his horse. You'll regret this. He rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Daniel did not watch him go. Instead, he carried the shovel to the far edge of the property. There, where the soil was soft, he dug a hole deep and wide. Elena watched from a distance as he lowered the shovel into the earth and covered it by hand, layer after layer, until nothing showed. His hands were stained with dirt when he returned, his face unreadable. That night, when Daniel stepped inside, a cup of cool water waited for him on the table. Beside it lay a flat stone. Drawn in ash across its surface was a small spiral, not an ending, but a turning inward, a beginning. For the first time since she had spoken her plea at the well, Daniel looked at Elena and thought not of fugitives or burdens. He thought of choices, and he realized he had already made his. The days that followed Draper's visit felt stretched thin, the air itself wired with tension. Daniel worked the fields with deliberate focus, sweat dripping into the dry earth, as if each strike of the plow could tamp down the unease. Elena moved through the cabin and garden like a wisp, quiet but purposeful, her hands always busy. yet neither of them spoke of Draper's words. His threat clung to them like smoke impossible to brush off. One evening, as twilight painted the horizon, Violet Daniel sat at the table, sharpening his pocket knife. The steady scrape of steel was the only sound until Elena broke it. "You buried the shovel," she said softly, not looking at him. Daniel didn't pause in his motion. "Tools shape men. Some make some destroy. I chose what kind it would be." She folded her hands in her lap. "I was afraid you wouldn't stop, that I would lose this place before I ever had it." Daniel set the knife down, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, neither spoke, but something unspoken bridged between them, an acknowledgment of how close he had come to giving in to the man he used to be. The tension returned 3 nights later in a far worse form. It began with a smell faint, but wrong, sharp, oily, acrid. Daniel stirred in bed, and the hair on his arms rising before his mind even formed the thought. Beside the hearth, Elena bolted upright, eyes wide. "Do you smell it?" she whispered. "Gasoline." Daniel was already moving boots, slamming to the floor. Out the back now. They grabbed nothing, only themselves. Daniel pulled open the trap door behind the root shelf, the tunnel he had dug years earlier, when fear of raids still haunted him. Elena didn't hesitate. She slid into the narrow passage, crawling through dirt and darkness. Daniel followed, sealing the trap door just as glass shattered above and fire roared through the kitchen. The tunnel spat them out behind the ridge where brush hid their bodies in shadow. They burst into the open just as the roof collapsed, sending sparks into the night sky. The cabin blazed flames licking at the heavens. From behind the brush, they watched. Draper's men circled the house rifles, loose laughter ringing cruel. One kicked over the stacked firewood, another stomped the garden. The sight twisted in Daniel's chest like a knife. His fists clenched, nails biting into his palms. "They came back," he muttered, eyes locked on the fire. "They took everything. Again." Elena gripped his sleeve, pulling him back from the edge, but he barely felt it. The reflection of flames flickered in his eyes, ghosts of war returning to haunt him. "They'll keep coming," he whispered. "This land, this life, it never stays. They can burn wood," Elena said firmly, voice steady despite her shaking hands. "But they can't burn what we choose to build again." Daniel didn't answer. He only stood rigid as the fire consumed the last of the home he had fought to keep. When dawn came, silence replaced the laughter. The cabin stood in ruins, black timbers jutting from ash like bones. Daniel stepped into the wreckage, boots crunching on char. He sank onto what had once been the front step. The wood crumbled beneath him, and he lowered his head into his hands. "We had nothing," he said, voice hollow. "We built something. Now it's gone." Elena walked carefully through the ash bent and lifted a stone scorched black. Still warm, still heavy, but solid. She found his knife half buried in soot, its blade warped but usable. Kneeling, she scratched a single word into the stone. "Stay." She carried it back and placed it at the threshold, the place where the door once stood. Daniel looked at it, then at her. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something alive. This land was burned before she said her voice, even though smoke still stung her lungs. "We made it bloom. We will again." He looked away, eyes catching on the ruins of the garden. "I don't know if I can start over. Watch it fall again." She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Then don't do it for the land. Don't even do it for me. Do it so you can say they didn't break you." A pause hung heavy between them. Finally, Daniel reached out slow and hesitant and took her hand. His fingers shook the first time she had seen his strength falter, yet his grip held. Together they stood among ashes, burned but upright, choosing to remain. The days that followed were filled with silence, not emptiness but labor. Daniel salvaged half-burnt planks, nails twisted but still usable stones pried from the chimney base. Elena cleared ground with a hoe, her bare feet, muddy movements steady. They worked until their bodies ached, stacking one beam at a time, setting posts into new earth. No roof yet, no chimney, only a frame. But it was enough, it meant forward. One afternoon, clouds gathered and the first raindrops fell. Daniel paused mid-swing hammer, dangling as he lifted his face. Elena, hair clinging to her cheeks, spread her hands to catch the drops. The rain fell steady, soaking the ash-stained soil, washing it clean. They didn't run. They stood in it, eyes closed, letting the water baptize what was left of the homestead. For the first time since the fire, the air smelled not of smoke, but of hope. That evening, Daniel and Elena worked together to hoist a heavy beam across the frame, the skeleton of their new roof. Daniel hammered it into place, then pulled his knife from his belt. Elena watched as he leaned close, carving into the wood. Not decoration, not ornament, just letters deliberate and plain. Her name. She stepped closer, touched the beam with her fingertips tracing the grooves. Her breath caught. "I've never seen my name carved in wood before." Daniel met her gaze at last. Now it holds the roof up. The frame of their new home stood against the sky, thin and fragile, but with her name etched into its heart. And for the first time since he had found her in the well, Daniel felt the weight of belonging not as a burden, but as a choice. Autumn crept into Texas with slow grace. The winds softened, the air cooled, and long blades of green began to rise through the ash where fire had once scorched the land. The Mercer homestead, though still fragile, stood again, new timbers framing a single room, a roof that creaked in wind, and a stone hearth rebuilt with hands worn raw. It was not much, but it was theirs. Daniel and Elena worked side by side each day. He split and hauled wood. She tended the new garden. They ate bread baked over the hearth, shared coffee boiled black, and rested against the unfinished walls as if they were already home. The bond between them did not come with vows or declarations. It grew like the seedling she coaxed from the earth, quiet, steady, and persistent. One afternoon, after Daniel returned from repairing a neighbor's wagon axle, he found Elena in the back garden, teaching children how to press herbs into cloth. At first, only curiosity had brought the women and their little ones to her door, but curiosity gave way to trust. She showed them how to make cough syrup from willow bark, how to dye fabric with beets and walnuts, how to stitch small symbols into aprons for protection and safe return. At first, they had eyed her warily, whispering that she was wild, dangerous. But when little Maggie Pearson's cough eased and Mrs. Boyd stitched her first quilt without breaking thread, their fear began to soften. Slowly, they called her something new. Sundaughter. Not fugitive, not property, not outcast Sundaughter. A name that felt like light. Daniel noticed the change in himself as much as in her. For years, he had kept to his own land, his work done in silence. But now, neighbors sought him out. He carved chairs for an elderly couple, fixed the wheels of a widow's cart, mended fence rails without asking for payment. Word spread the quiet man knew wood charged fair and didn't ask questions. Elena watched these changes with a private smile. In giving her a name, Daniel had anchored her to the earth again. In turn, she had drawn him back into life, pulling him out of the ghosts that had stalked him for years. One evening, after the children left, Daniel returned with something wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table without a word. Elena unwrapped it carefully to reveal a handmade bowl, simple but sturdy, glazed with uneven ridges. Inside, painted in soft ochre, was a sun, and beneath it a hand. She traced the glaze with her fingers, eyes shimmering in the firelight. "It belongs here," she whispered. Then she rose, pressed her forehead gently to his, a gesture from her mother's people that spoke gratitude deeper than words. Daniel stood still, awkward, but moved, the warmth of her presence settling over him like the slow glow of dusk. Their new home was far from finished, but it breathed. Each day added something small, a patch of roof tightened, a beam smoothed, herbs hung drying from the rafters. At night, rain drummed on the canvas stretched overhead, and they lay near the hearth counting the drops. Daniel carved names into beams for neighbors who sought his skill. One porch bore the initials of 3 orphaned brothers. Another fence carried the mark of a widow who had nothing to give but thanks. With each carving, Daniel's hands grew steadier, his purpose clearer. Elena, too, left her mark. She stitched cloth bags for children embroidered with birds or spirals, gifts that carried meaning. Some women brought her bruises or broken thread. She gave them remedies, patience, and laughter. What began as suspicion transformed into quiet gatherings that filled the Mercer cabin with warmth and chatter. But whispers still lingered. Some ranchers muttered that a red girl had no place teaching their wives. Others said Daniel had been cursed, letting his land bloom by unnatural means. The frontier had never forgiven easily, and suspicion never died quickly. Yet each time Daniel heard the whispers, he remembered the night of the fire, the word "stay" scratched into a stone, and the way Elena had stood in the rain with her hands lifted as if baptizing the land anew. One afternoon, as summer gave way to crisp skies, Elena carried a bundle of straw across the yard. The ground, slick with rain, betrayed her step. She slipped and fell hard, landing in a patch of mud with a startled cry. For a moment she lay stunned, then laughter burst from her chest, loud, unguarded, alive. Daniel looked up from the frame he was hammering. He stared for a heartbeat, then, against his own surprise, he laughed too. The sound cracked from disuse, rough but real. He strode over, offered her a hand. "You all right?" he asked, his mouth twitching toward a smile. "I think the ground just wanted a hug," she said, grinning back her dress soaked with mud. That evening, they hoisted the main roof beam together. Daniel hammered it into place, then pulled his knife and carved her name into the pine. No flourish, no ceremony, just letters cut deep, steady. Elena pressed her fingertips to the grooves, breath-catching. "I've never seen my name in wood before," she murmured. Daniel met her eyes. "Now it holds the roof up." The words hung between them, more than practical, less than confession, but enough. When night fell, rain returned, drumming softly on the canvas. They lit a small fire, shared bread wrapped in cloth, and sat together beneath the carved beam. Elena leaned back, counting the drops that slipped through the cracks, each one a promise that their life, fragile though it was, would endure. Daniel watched her in the glow of firelight, her features softened by peace he had never thought possible. And, in that quiet, for the first time since the war, he did not dream of violence. He dreamed only of walls finished a roof whole, and laughter spilling from a home that had once risen out of ash. The house was not just standing, it was becoming. And so were they. By early spring, the land around the Mercer homestead had transformed. Green shoots covered the ground that once smoldered with ash, and the stone chimney rose like a weathered spine against the sky. Birds returned to the cottonwoods by the creek, their calls carrying on the breeze. The air smelled of damp soil, of earth softened by rain and time. Inside the rebuilt cabin, Daniel sat at a small desk by the window. The journal before him was thick with entries, some practical notes about repairs and tools, others restless sketches of thoughts he rarely spoke aloud. On a fresh page, his pencil hovered before pressing to the paper. "You said you would belong to me," he wrote slowly, "but you gave me something greater. You made me belong to this earth again." He stopped. The words felt heavier than the page could hold. He closed the book gently, setting it aside before stepping outside to gather firewood. Later, as stew simmered on the hearth and the sky deepened to rose and gray, Elena reached for the journal while sweeping. Her hand stilled when she saw the open page. She read the words twice, tracing them with her finger as if the ink carried warmth. She did not say a word when Daniel returned. Not until the bowls were washed, the lamp turned low, and the house settled into silence. "You didn't mean for me to see that," she whispered. Daniel looked up, startled. "No," she nodded, almost smiling. Then she moved closer, laying her hand lightly over his. "Where there is your quiet work, where there is bread and fire, that is where I stay." Daniel closed his fingers over hers. The warmth between them was not sudden. It had been growing steady as spring beneath frost until it had finally broken through. Their life together settled into a rhythm. Mornings were filled with work, splitting wood, tending crops, mending fences. Afternoons brought neighbors to Daniel's bench with tools to repair or timber to cut. Evenings belonged to the gatherings Elena hosted mothers with their children, girls with thread and cloth voices weaving together in the small cabin. The name son-daughter spread beyond whispers, spoken with a mixture of respect and affection. Women carried her remedies home. Children wore her stitched charms. Where once she had been feared, now she was sought out. Yet not everything softened. Rumors lingered at the edges of town, fueled by men like Draper, who spat her name with disdain. They said a homestead built on ash could not last, that a man like Daniel had no business protecting a woman like her. But every time Daniel heard such words, he only worked harder, built sturdier, carved deeper. Elena answered them differently. She taught the women how to plant gardens where none had grown before, how to weave their own strength into every thread. She healed the bruises that some carried silently, offering not pity but knowledge. Slowly, suspicion eroded into something stronger than fear community. One evening, while Daniel repaired a chair by the hearth, Elena set a bowl in the center of the table. It was the one he had made for her months earlier, painted with the sun above a hand. She added a sprig of sage inside a symbol from her mother's teachings. When Daniel looked up, she said simply, "This is our table." He didn't answer with words. Instead, he placed his pocket knife beside the bowl, its blade worn but still sharp. To him, it was not just a tool, it was his past, his battles, his survival. By setting it there, he gave her more than company. He gave her his trust. Elena's eyes softened. She leaned her forehead against his, once more sealing the unspoken bond they had built, not of ownership, not of obligation, but of choice. The years of fire and violence still haunted Daniel's dreams, but they no longer held him captive. He woke to the scent of coffee, to the sound of Elena's voice, teaching children outside, to the laughter of women sharing bread. His hands, once known for pulling triggers, now carved names into wood marks of life instead of death. And Elena, once hunted, no longer measured her worth by how quickly she could run or how quietly she could hide. She stitched her name into the beams of their home, into the soil she tilled, into the lives of the women who gathered around her fire. She had belonged to many names before none her own. Now she was both son-daughter and Elena Black, chosen and choosing. Together, they rebuilt not just a house, but a place where no chain or badge or brand could dictate who belonged. The lesson of their story was simple, though not easy. Love was not found in chains or bargains, nor in the desperate plea of belonging forced by fear. It was carved in wood, planted in soil, rebuilt from ash. It was found in the freedom to choose and in the courage to stay. Daniel once thought belonging meant carrying the weight of another life on his shoulders. Elena had shown him otherwise. Belonging, true belonging, was a gift freely given and shared. And in that truth, both of them were remade. So, when storms gathered on the horizon, they no longer braced for what would be lost. They stood together, knowing that whatever burned, they would rebuild. The earth itself seemed to answer green, pushing through where fire had once reigned. Their story was not of possession, but of redemption. Not of captivity, but of choice. In each sunrise, each beam of wood, each handful of soil, they wrote it again. Two people who chose each other, and in doing so, chose life. If you've followed Daniel and Elena's journey, you know it was never about one saving the other. It was about two people finding the courage to rebuild not just a home, but themselves. They remind us that love is strongest when it isn't demanded but offered freely. Belonging is not about possession. It is about choice, about standing in the ashes together and deciding to plant again. So, if this story touched you, if you felt the ache of loss and the bloom of hope, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that healing doesn't come from control, but from freedom, patience, and love that endures. And if you believe, like Daniel and Elena, that even burnt land can bloom again, subscribe and stay with us for more tales of resilience, devotion, and hope. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to stay.